Hollywood's golden reels have always had a dirty underbelly. But what if I told you some of the movies you love were bankrolled by mobsters, drug lords, and real-life villains who didn't just watch crime on screen? They brought it to the set. Forget harmless producers and studio notes. Here, the investors had body counts. Ever wondered what happens when the money behind the camera comes with a hit list? Buckle up, because what's lurking in these film credits might just shock you wide awake. The Cotton Club, 1984. Before you even heard the phrase mob movie, there was a mob behind the movie. The Cotton Club, a lavish Francis Ford Coppola epic set in Harlem's jazz-soaked underworld, was itself soaked in actual crime lord money. Think movie moguls in pinstripes? Try shadowy figures in bulletproof vests. The wildest part? The film's funding played out like a deleted scene from Goodfellas, except no one was acting. Behind the scenes, a flamboyant, coke-fueled impresario named Roy Radin wanted to break into Hollywood. Enter Robert Evans, legendary Paramount producer and man magnet for chaos. Their collaboration began with handshakes and dreams of Oscar gold. But the movie's $58 million budget didn't just come from studio pockets. Enter mob lawyer David Beagleman, shadowy financiers, and, unmistakably, the money of real-life East Coast and West Coast crime syndicates. It wasn't just loose change. Drug cash, laundered bills, and mob investments all flowed into the production. As the film ballooned in cost, the criminals wanted more than a cut. Infighting, threats, and intimidation riddled the shoot. The set was crawling with private security, not to protect the stars, but to keep gangsters from shaking down the producers. And when Roy Radin's body turned up, riddled with bullets in a remote canyon, the truth came crawling out. The infamous Cotton Club murder exploded across headlines, pulling in everyone from Hollywood A-listers to mafiosi and washed-up actresses. The details? Radin was executed in a mob-style hit over a share of the profits, with links leading back to drug deals, Hollywood fixer Karen Greenberger, and whispers of other unsolved crimes. Ironically, the finished film is a gorgeous, stylized take on Harlem's criminal nightlife, but the real action was always off-screen. The Cotton Club bombed at the box office, leaving nothing but rumors, ruined reputations, and one of the industry's most infamous cold cases. In the end, it proved that sometimes the scariest criminals aren't in front of the camera. They're in the credits. Gotti, 1996. Some films are so close to real life, you can practically smell the gunpowder. Gotti, the made-for-TV mob drama, wasn't just about New York's Teflon Don. It was fueled, steered, and shadowed by the very world it portrayed. While most Hollywood stories about organized crime rely on research and consultants, this one had the real Gambino family peering over its shoulder, and maybe even reaching for their wallets. The film's production was like walking through a minefield in a Brioni suit. It began innocently enough, with writer Steve Shagan and producer Robert Cooper eager to capture the story of John Gotti, the most notorious mob boss since Capone. But Gotti was no ordinary subject. In 1992, while the script was circulating, John Gotti himself was facing trial after trial, making headlines with every grin and wave. The allure of authenticity brought the filmmakers far closer to the underworld than anyone bargained for. Rumors quickly swirled that Gotti's own associates, some with clean names, others infamous in Brooklyn and Queens, offered help with funding, locations, and even casting. Wise guys frequented the set, dispensing stories and corrections, and, according to whispers, keeping an eye on the production's cash flow. In one surreal episode, producers were reportedly summoned to private meetings with gentlemen you don't want to owe money to. The message? Get it right and keep certain scenes accurate, or else. One former associate even claimed the film received loans that didn't come with typical studio paperwork. The line between fact and fiction blurred further when the film's cast and crew began hearing stories about Gotti's real-life exploits. straight from men who'd actually stood beside him in court, or in the back room of an Italian social club. Some actors were warned not to ask too many questions, while others found themselves with late-night phone calls offering advice. Ultimately, Gotti the film became a magnet for every wise guy wannabe, with the production serving as a playground for New York's criminal elite. Despite, or maybe because of, these connections, Gotti became a cult hit. It wasn't a glossy, distant take on mafia life. It was up close, personal, and dangerous. If you want to watch a mob film with real underworld fingerprints all over it, you can't do better or riskier than this one. Goodfellas, 1990. When Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas hit the screen, audiences were stunned by its raw energy, cold-blooded violence, and the feeling that it was just a little too real. That's because, behind the iconic suits and soundtrack, there was more mafia in the mix than most people realized, and not all of it was make-believe. Some of the money that helped get Goodfellas made didn't just come from Hollywood. It slithered up from New York's criminal underground. Scorsese wanted the real deal, and the real deal came calling. Consultants weren't just ex-cops or journalists. They were former mobsters, guys with faces you wouldn't want to see at the end of a dark alley. These weren't technical advisors. They were the men the movie was based on. Henry Hill, the notorious wise guy at the heart of the story, was involved at every stage, sharing stories, correcting dialogue, and even pointing out which scenes were too soft. But the authenticity didn't end there. The financing for Goodfellas was allegedly sweetened by under-the-table deals, and the involvement of shadowy figures with their own interests in seeing the mafia's story told a certain way. According to insiders, some investors had more than just a love of cinema. They had rap sheets. The set itself was a who's who of mobbed-up personalities. Some extras were real gangsters, using the movie as an alibi or a chance to launder a little cash. Crew members joked, nervously, that if you lost money on the film, you wouldn't want to collect in person. Even Scorsese himself admitted to getting phone calls from guys who insisted on historical accuracy. There were warnings: portray certain bosses respectfully, or you might find your editing suite unguarded. Ray Liotta later confessed that some scenes were so charged, you could feel the ghosts of real-life wise guys lurking just off camera. Goodfellas ended up becoming a cinematic masterpiece, a love letter, and a cautionary tale, all at once. It immortalized the mafia, and in a twisted way, let them cash in on their own legend. The lines between art and life, legal and illegal, were as blurry as a mobster's tax return. In the end, the film's success meant everyone got paid, some more quietly than others. Donnie Brasco, 1997. Sometimes a movie about crime is so embedded in the real thing, you wonder if the cameras are the least dangerous things on set. That's the story behind Donnie Brasco, the undercover saga that blurred the lines between movie-making and mob money in ways that would make the FBI sweat. Based on the true story of FBI agent Joseph D. Pistone's infiltration of the Bonanno crime family, Donnie Brasco is a masterclass in tension, betrayal, and underworld paranoia. But the film's own journey to the screen could have been its own mob movie. For starters, some of the producers and financiers had New York connections that raised more than a few eyebrows. Industry gossip claims that a chunk of the film's funding was funneled in through silent partners, men with businesses in the construction, nightclub, and waste disposal trades, mob code for the usual suspects. One financier, later indicted on racketeering charges, had a direct pipeline into the project. Money passed through layers of shell companies, just murky enough for the studio to look the other way, but transparent enough for anyone in the know to recognize the smell of the street. A handful of scenes were shot on locations arranged by friends of the family, no permits needed, just a nod from a neighborhood boss. The criminal influence wasn't limited to cash. Real-life mobsters showed up on set, some looking for work, others just curious. Al Pacino's wardrobe was so spot on that an ex-hitman reportedly asked if he'd borrowed Lefty Ruggiero's actual shoes. Stories of intimidation, last-minute script changes, and late-night advice to producers abounded. Even Pistone himself worried that some of the movie's funding could become an evidentiary nightmare if anyone decided to dig deep enough. But here's the kicker. Donnie Brasco didn't just bring the underworld to the screen. It invited them to the premiere. The finished film is a nerve-shredding portrait of life inside the mafia, made eerily authentic by the real mob fingerprints all over the production. The line between Hollywood fantasy and street reality was never thinner or more dangerous. The Godfather, 1972. No film on this list is more mythic or more mobbed up than The Godfather. It's the ultimate mafia epic, but what most viewers don't realize is how deeply the mafia embedded itself into the film's DNA. If you thought The Godfather was just a product of studio brilliance, you're only half right. The other half came courtesy of New York's five families, whether Hollywood liked it or not. When Paramount Pictures greenlit Mario Puzo's bestseller, the real-life mob wasn't pleased. Early rumors spread that the Italian-American Civil Rights League, led by Joe Colombo, a major mob boss, demanded script approval. What's not as widely known is that early investors and backers, anxious about Hollywood's finances and the film's potentially controversial content, sought money from private sources. Some of those sources, it turned out, had last names that ended in vowels and a history of business interests in nightclubs, unions, and concrete. Legend has it that envelopes of cash were delivered to key production figures, often with gentle reminders to keep the mafia looking noble. Mob consultants prowled the set, making sure scenes were accurate, or sometimes cleaned up. One mobster even demanded a role as an extra, and got it. Meanwhile, the cast was warned not to improvise anything disrespectful about real-life bosses. When Francis Ford Coppola's crew filmed in New York, they were often trailed by shadowy well-wishers in Cadillacs, making sure everything ran smoothly. There's also the not-so-small matter of protection rackets. Paramount reportedly paid hefty fees to ensure the safety of their cast, crew, and expensive equipment. In one instance, the word mafia was allegedly removed from the script at the league's demand. Talk about script notes with teeth. The result? The Godfather became a landmark of American cinema and an unintentional tribute to the very criminals it set out to expose. It's the most glamorous mob movie of all time, and maybe, just maybe, the most mobbed up. Scarface, 1983. Some movies just attract trouble. Scarface, Brian De Palma's cocaine-dusted masterpiece, is notorious for pushing the boundaries of violence and excess. But what's less known is that while Al Pacino was bringing Tony Montana to life, real Miami drug lords were knocking on the door, offering money, protection, and maybe a little creative input. Hollywood has never danced closer to the fire. As De Palma and screenwriter Oliver Stone set up shop in Miami, the city was in the midst of a cocaine explosion. Real kingpins wanted to be part of the spectacle. In fact, production was reportedly delayed, and locations were moved after the crew received thinly veiled threats from local criminals who didn't like the way their world was being portrayed. But it wasn't just threats. Behind the scenes, some very serious offers of investment came from Miami's underworld. A few wanted cameos. Others wanted to help with the authenticity of the drug trade sequences, in exchange for a taste of the profits, or, at the very least, a mention in the credits. There were whispers that some of the film's backers, shell companies with mysterious addresses, and even more mysterious board members, were fronts for laundering drug cash. The authorities kept a wary eye, but Hollywood, always desperate for money, sometimes looked the other way when the check cleared. Production was plagued by harassment and intimidation. One night, several trailers were vandalized, and a threatening message was left for De Palma. As a result, a chunk of the movie was filmed in Los Angeles instead, far from Miami's wildest elements. Ironically, the mayhem behind the scenes gave Scarface an air of danger and authenticity that no amount of method acting could buy. The finished film is a fever dream of criminal ambition, but its real legacy might be the way it invited the underworld to bankroll the fantasy. In a city built on drug money, Scarface was both a reflection and a product of its time. Pulp Fiction, 1994. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction is a wild, anarchic ride through Los Angeles' seedy underbelly, but the story of its financing might be even more twisted than the plot itself. Independent cinema in the 1990s was a risky business, and risk attracts a certain kind of investor, namely, the sort who doesn't mind if the money comes with a little blood on it. Miramax famously distributed Pulp Fiction, but the original funding was a patchwork of private investors. Some were movie buffs. Others, according to persistent rumors, were looking for ways to turn cash businesses into above-board profits. Several early backers had backgrounds in the nightclub and strip club scene, industries notorious for laundering mob money. Tarantino himself has joked about the colorful personalities who attended his early meetings, and if the stories are true, at least one silent partner was later convicted on racketeering charges unrelated to the movie. During production, bags of cash allegedly changed hands with few questions asked. Some crew members would later claim that certain invoices were paid in cash in the parking lot by a guy who definitely wasn't in the movie business. If you think that's just Hollywood gossip, consider this. An LAPD task force briefly investigated several Pulp Fiction investors for money laundering after one was implicated in a wider criminal probe. Nothing stuck, but the legend only grew. The result is the ultimate cult film, made with the kind of reckless abandon and financial ambiguity that you only get when everyone involved is just a little bit afraid of the real story getting out. Pulp Fiction changed cinema, but it also reminded Hollywood that when you play with fire, you just might get burned or end up with a hit. Once Upon a Time in America, 1984. Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America isn't just an epic about gangsters, betrayal, and the American dream gone sour. It's a movie with mob fingerprints all over the celluloid. While the film's sprawling story of Jewish hoodlums clawing their way up through Prohibition-era New York is legend, the real drama was going down in boardrooms and back alleys across Europe, where the line between investor and kingpin was as thin as a razor blade. Leone, already a cinematic titan thanks to his spaghetti westerns, wanted his magnum opus to outshine anything Hollywood had ever produced. The problem: his vision required not just time and patience, but serious cash. American studios coughed up some funding, but the real money, the stacks of untraceable lira, francs, and dollars, came pouring in from Italy, thanks to a cast of producers whose day jobs just happened to include international crime. The connections are almost comical if they weren't so brazen. At least two major Italian backers were later indicted for laundering mob money, one for heroin smuggling, another for a web of offshore accounts that would make a banker blush. One producer, splashed across European tabloids after a corruption scandal, vanished into thin air, leaving behind unpaid bills, nervous lawyers, and plenty of nervous whispers about where the money really came from. Filming itself sometimes felt more like a mob summit than a movie set. Crew members traded stories about advisors, arriving in tailored suits, all charm and menace, offering guidance on everything from dialogue to where the bodies should be buried, literally and cinematically. Some New York locations only became available after large, anonymous cash payments to union bosses, with connections you didn't question if you valued your kneecaps. Catering contracts went to companies with suspiciously long rap sheets, and more than once, scenes were delayed because a friend of the production wanted to inspect the set. The criminal flavor didn't stop at the water's edge. When the film premiered in Europe, the guest lists read like a who's who of the underworld: mobsters, politicians, starlets, and their nervous bodyguards, all brushing shoulders at lavish after-parties. Some whispered that the film's distribution in certain countries was handled by syndicates eager to wash more than just their money through a big-name movie. Yet for all its shady origins, Leone's film stands tall, a masterpiece that's as much a product of its real-world backers as of its legendary director. In the end, the most powerful gangsters weren't on the screen. They were in the credits, counting the box office take and making sure their names never made the headlines. Mean Streets, 1973. Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets didn't just depict New York's Little Italy underworld. It was practically a family photo album funded by the neighborhood's real-life wise guys. Picture this. It's 1972, and Scorsese is a hungry, unproven director with a vision so gritty, so authentic, even Hollywood's hippest producers flinched. Back then, no one wanted to bankroll a film about small-time hoods hustling for respect. Except, of course, the actual small-time hoods themselves. Financing Mean Streets was an exercise in old-school, backroom negotiation. Scorsese and producer Jonathan Taplin scoured every smoky club, dingy bar, and private social club in Little Italy looking for cash. The big studios wanted nothing to do with a project that felt more like an FBI surveillance tape than a movie script. So, the money came from the only place willing to roll the dice: the streets. Taplin later admitted, without a hint of shame, that much of the movie's budget was cobbled together from loans given by local nightclub owners, bookmakers, and other enterprising figures with thick accents and thin patience for paperwork. These weren't just movie fans. Some were laundering money. Others wanted to see their own legends immortalized on film. Repayment wasn't a matter of interest rates. It was more, you know where to find me if the movie makes it big. Rumor has it, one particularly bruising barroom brawl in the film was inspired by a real fight involving one of the investors. A guy who insisted on a cameo and got it, right in the thick of the action. Security on set? That came courtesy of neighborhood bosses, who encouraged local businesses to close for filming in exchange for a few envelopes and some free publicity. This was a production where craft services meant cannoli from the family bakery and set dressing came courtesy of whoever owed the mob a favor that week. Scorsese would later confess that he was constantly on edge, not just about his artistic choices, but about who might show up on set looking for their slice. He knew, deep down, that without the underworld's patronage, Mean Streets would have died in a pile of rejection letters. Instead, it became his breakout, launching a career and setting the blueprint for every mob movie that followed. The ultimate irony. Mean Streets is a film about a guy desperately trying to escape the criminal life, funded and protected by men who never really wanted to leave it behind. Only in Hollywood, or Little Italy. Cleopatra Jones and the Casino of Gold, 1975. Not every crime-funded film ends up in the Criterion Collection. Some just slide right into cult legend, sticky with scandal, cheap thrills, and the whiff of something illegal in the air. Enter Cleopatra Jones and the Casino of Gold. This wasn't just a blaxploitation sequel. It was a masterclass in cinematic laundering, where crime lords from both sides of the Pacific cashed in on the B-movie boom. The 1970s blaxploitation wave was Hollywood's Wild West for low-budget dreams and high-stakes hustles. Major studios, desperate for hits, barely blinked when investors arrived in pinstripes and gold chains, suitcases bulging with unmarked bills. For Cleopatra Jones and the Casino of Gold, the money trail led from the streets of Harlem to the neon-soaked back alleys of Hong Kong. American mobsters, flush from drug deals and gambling halls, saw Hollywood as the perfect laundromat for their profits. But they weren't the only ones with dollar signs in their eyes. Chinese triad bosses wanted a piece of the kung fu craze, eager to launder cash from casinos and nightclubs right into movie magic. The set was a circus of underworld influence. Actors reported minders, not studio assistants, but real enforcers, stationed on set, eyes glued to the ledgers and protecting the investment. It wasn't just about counting the cash. These shadowy figures offered advice on everything from wardrobe to dialogue, eager to make sure their communities were shown in the right light, or at least not shown at all. Casting calls sometimes doubled as debt collections. Crew members whispered about roles handed out to friends of the syndicates, or to local gamblers who needed to pay off a bad hand. Want a part as an extra? Maybe win big at Mahjong first. Even the shooting locations reflected the chaos. The film's pivotal scenes weren't secured with permits, but with a nod from the local triad leader, meaning the police stayed away, and the cameras rolled in some of Hong Kong's most dangerous real-life corners. Offset, at least one producer was later busted on racketeering charges, his movie career exposed as just another front for moving criminal profits across borders. And yet, for all its shady origins, Cleopatra Jones and the Casino of Gold still shines as a fever dream of 1970s cool, brash, fast, and absolutely unbothered by its outlaw roots. It became a cult classic, a testament to how Hollywood will always find a way to turn the worst money into the wildest movies. Sometimes, the real hustle isn't on the screen. It's who's paying for the popcorn. So, the next time you settle in for a crime classic, remember, sometimes the real drama is hiding in the opening credits. Hollywood has always had a soft spot for outlaws, but when the money comes straight from the mob, every scene feels a little more dangerous and a lot more real. Which of these stories surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts below, hit that subscribe button, and tell us, would you risk the mob for your shot at Hollywood glory? Keep watching, and keep your friends close.